Welcome back to Kevin Toll Reads, where today I have three short stories for Saturday Shorts. Stick around. So, our first short story from 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger is For Esme with Love and Squalor. Published in 1953, it's 27 pages in length in my edition. I've been wanting to read this for quite some time. It is touted as one of the stronger entries in this short story collection, and yeah, I finally got around to doing it, and I'm glad I read it. So let's talk about it. Summary of this thing. Sergeant X, who is stationed over in England during World War II, he is on station, goes to a tea room to have cinnamon toast and tea, and runs into a girl that he saw at a choir practice on his way to the tea room. Her and her brother are there with her, I'm assuming, caring person, not their mother or father that you later learn about, but they are there, and Esme, the young girl, comes over to Sergeant X and strikes up a conversation, and her brother comes over, and like most younger brothers, is very kind of annoying in a younger brotherly way, which I thought was really done really well. But Esme strikes up a conversation. The man, Sergeant X, realizes very quickly that Esme is beyond her years and maturity, and that's when he learns a little bit more about their parents, and obviously their parents are more than likely have passed. And Esme talks about her love for reading, and she's very well stated. She's very highly of herself, and the gentleman finds this very interesting. And so when he mentions that he does like to write, she asks him if he's published, and he kind of glosses over that fact, but they promise to have correspondence. And Esme lets him know that she likes to read squalor, and he finds that very fascinating. And so they go on to say their goodbyes, and they have this cordial meeting. That is kind of like the first half of this story. The second half deals with Sergeant X after the war and what he's dealing with, and his post-traumatic stress disorder and his physical ailments. And so you have two jarringly different, kind of contrasting sections to this little short story. But within those two halves, I think you also have within each half two contrasting themes. And so in the first half, you have the contrasting theme is you have a gentleman on station. He has the conversation with this young girl, and it reminded me heavily of A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which is also in this collection, and specifically the beach scene where the gentleman has a very awkward and conversation with the child, and I got kind of vibes of that. And I don't know if that's just Salinger writing that conversation in there with intent, or it just came off that way, but it felt kind of weird. At least that's the way I read it. It could be just me. The second half, where we get the ailments, the after effects of war with Sergeant X, you have a contrast with his tour mate, Clay, and how Clay is somewhat annoying, very talkative, everything that Sergeant X doesn't want Clay to be is, and very annoying. It's very interestingly purposely put in there to kind of also shed light to how messed up Sergeant X is after the war. And so I thought that was really well done, kind of nicely crafted by Salinger. The title in itself, I think, it raises questions from the reader's perspective of how, why it's titled that way. Esme does talk about squalor. She eventually writes him a letter that he gets after the war, and it was interesting for him to read that and what transpires. I think that may have to do a little bit with the love that he has, even in light of all of the after effects of the war. The squalor thing obviously has to do with war just in general, or it has to do with the fact that Esme lets on at the beginning of the story about her parents. And so I thought that was really interesting. And in terms of excerpts, there's two of them that are really, really good. Both of them, I think, are very fitting for this book, and they highlight some of the characters and themes really well. One is, I ignored the flashes of lightning around me. They either had your number on them or they didn't. And that was definitely the mindset of Sergeant X at the beginning of this story. And then the second mindset of Sergeant X was this quote: he felt his mind dislodge itself and teeter like unsecure luggage on an overhead rack. And that was the contrasting difference in the mental positivity of this character. In terms of rating and overall, I give this a 3.9. Not my favorite short story, but a very good one. One that you're very glad that you read. It's very entertaining. It draws you to think a lot. Definitely reflect back into how life was during this time period. Obviously, it's definitely heavily character driven. There's not a resolution. The ending is very anticlimactic for me, at least in my opinion, but I think that was the intent from Salinger when he wrote this. And that's my take for the short story For Esme with Love and Squalor by J.D. Salinger. I give it a 3.9 out of 5. And so my next short story was from this collection of mysteries by Edgar Allan Poe. We are talking the short story The Telltale Heart. And I think I've read this before, but I'm not completely 100% certain. I'm pretty sure I have. It was published in 1843. It's 8 pages in length. It's definitely a mystery, I would say light horror maybe. I read this immersively. I was doing a little research about it because I was thinking, have I read this before? And when I was doing research, I noticed that it's definitely in the public domain now, and there is on YouTube, there is some narrations of this tale, and one was done by Sir Christopher Lee, and I thought, oh, that's got to be great. So I started listening to it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is brilliant. So I definitely highly suggest you check that out. But the summary of this is you have an unnamed individual. It's written in first person, and you get it through the perspective of this unnamed individual. You don't know if it's a man or a woman. Not that that is indicative or necessary for the story, but you get their perspective heavily, and it's almost like you're in their skin as they are talking about this perfect murder that they're about to carry out, and the planning and the execution and the patience that they have, because they can no longer take this old man and his gray, milky eye that just gets under their skin to the point where they feel like there's no other release for their mental state and struggle with this than killing this old man. And so you get to see that perspective from the narrator, and it's very interesting in terms of premise as a short story. So what makes it really good? The planning, the sneaking, the just really, you get to see to what level of meticulous, delivery that this person goes about to do this. I mean, they spend a week visiting the old man's room quietly, so slowly, so deliberately, from opening the door to opening the latch and the shroud of the lantern. So it just gets on that eye because it just drives them mad. And, you really feel the feelings of the narrator through Poe's writing. His prose is just excellent. It's 200 years old almost, and it's really written really well. You also get a huge change in emotion in the narrator that you also feel, because it goes from, I've got to get this done, and then it's like, oh, I committed the perfect crime. I'm so crafty and clever, and then it becomes this, something happens, and there's this haunting, overcoming guilt that happens. Yeah. So there's also a lot of what's the meaning here. What's the meaning of this story? Why did Poe write this story in this way? And to me, the story represents kind of how someone can become almost so unhinged by their own paranoia, that they stoop to murder over something as this eye that drives them nuts, and how they become from assuredly confident, then they just crumble and fall apart. They're mentally obviously unstable, and it's more of Poe's way of saying, either directly or indirectly, that really someone's perspective can become everything. And so I really enjoyed that. In terms of excerpts, there was something I wanted to share with you. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the I forever. I thought it was a really, really good one. In terms of rating and overall, I give this a 4.1. I think it is a very well crafted little tale. I think it's very powerful. It's really, Poe's writing of this is really stripped down to anything that is completely unnecessary. It is not in here. I find that it's very visceral. It's very ragged. It's not only about what is said, but what's also inferred in some of the themes here. And I think it's just really well done. And so that's my take of A Telltale Heart from Edgar Allan Poe. I gave it a 4.1 out of 5. And so now we're going to dive back into the world of H.P. Lovecraft, and we're going to be talking about The Statement of Randolph Carter, written in 1919. It is 9 pages in length. Obviously, this is a horror, part of the Lovecraft dream cycles, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I read this one immersively as well. I know Tim at Secret Fire Books has talked about horror babble on YouTube. They have a YouTube channel. They do some narration of some classic horror stories, Lovecraft being one of them, and their recording of this is just great. And so I was following along in this collection that I have and listening to that on Horror Babble on YouTube. Oh man, it was so good. And so the summary of this is the account of Randolph Carter and what happened to his friend Harley Warren, who is a researcher of the occult and maybe even a practitioner, and a fateful night in a Gainesville cemetery in the Cypress Swamp, and what happens underground at a sepulcher. And yeah, it is basically Randolph Carter giving this account of what happened to his friend, or what he knows. And so what does he know? And so let's talk about what I enjoyed. I really thought, I thought it was really good. There's definitely a writing style that Lovecraft has that I just haven't read from anyone else. Howard to some degree. I would even say Poe maybe to a little bit, but Lovecraft kind of stands on its own with his prose. I mean, he really does. It is amazing. I really enjoyed Warren Carter. I think their friendship and how they interact in this tale is really, really well done. The dread that is kind of build up through the story that meets a head at the end of the story. It's a satisfying conclusion that happens there's so much that happens in such a short amount of pages. I did a little research because I don't really know a whole lot about Lovecraft just yet, and Randolph Carter appears in 7 other stories and 7 other entries by Lovecraft, a couple of them being novellas, which are all part of his dream cycle, which is kind of these interrelated stories about a place that he created called the Dreamlands. And so I kind of looked online a little bit more about that because, again, I'm pretty green when it comes to Lovecraft, but Dreamlands is this place where it appears in Lovecraft's works, and you can't get there in the normal way. It is only through dreams, and it kind of resides outside of our own time and space, which is very kind of cosmic-y and very cool. There's actually also been a couple pastiche novels written regarding this kind of mythos, this fantastical world. One of them being The Dream Quest of Villet Bow by Kij Johnson, which I will post a link to that that cover there. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so definitely enjoyed the story, enjoyed for what it was. It definitely builds and builds and builds. So let's talk about an excerpt that I thought, yeah, it was a really good one. I mean, this is just so deliciously descriptive. I mean, it just encompasses everything. I mean, you can almost, when I was reading this, I could almost feel like the swampy, warm, cypressy swamp in Cemetery when it felt like I was right there. And so the excerpt is this: on every hand were the signs of neglect and decrepitude, and I seemed haunted by the notion that Warren and I were the first living creatures to invade a lethal silence of centuries. I mean, it's just so good. So good. So in terms of rating and overall, I mean, a 4.5. I mean, come on. I mean, this is so good. I mean, he is just such a master storyteller. I really like the style of this, how he set this up as an account. I thought it sucked me in from the very beginning. Warren carries this little book with him. They talked about, he gets these books from India. And so you get this kind of little nods to like, okay, that's not right type thing. And I think it's done so well. Lovecraft doesn't waste words. Everything has a meaning. Everything has a purpose. It's just so well done, so well written. Definitely am going to dig further in this whole dream cycle. I definitely want to read more tales. There is another one that deals with Randolph Carter, and so I definitely want to check that out. And then there's different ties and connections, how they're loosely connected. I'm just very always interested in that. So very excited. I'm glad I read this. Really, really enjoyed it this week. H.P. Lovecraft, and that's my take. 4.5 out of 5 for The Statement of Randolph Carter by H.P. Lovecraft. And that's my take for Saturday Shorts. I continue to really enjoy Saturday Shorts. This is a longer one, so thanks for sticking around with me if you made it to the end. And again, if you know the answer to the riddle for Esme with Love and Squalor, what did one wall say to the other? Drop me a comment. Let me know what the answer is. All right. I'll talk to you all in the next one. Thanks.